So everyone, please join me in welcoming Alex to SPC. We are very excited to host you. Alex, as you know, SPC really specializes in the -1 part of the founder journey. And that really means, in that squiggle, in that kind of soup, if you will, of kind of like trying out different ideas, stress testing them, talking to people about it. So take us back to the -1 days of your own journey. Like, did you try out different ideas before you kind of converged on scale? What were the early days of ideation and kind of like for you?
Yeah, so we did YC, and the first half of our batch, I would say, was probably, we refer to as a squiggle, was sort of like highly. There's a lot of existential angst. You don't really know what you're doing with your life, and uh, and I remember it was kind of like, yeah, I remember this time you have like these Google Docs of startup ideas, and you sort of like keep trying to come up with more startup ideas. I remember I read Paul Graham's essay, How to Come Up with Startup Ideas. And that was actually a really good focusing framework, which was, I think, the basic ideas like you like live in the future, what are the things that exist in the future, and sort of like build backwards. But yeah, it was like, it was very unclear. I think when you're certainly when I was in YC and probably a community like this, like there's a lot of people working a lot of things around you. And so it's very hard to have any sense of, you know, what is a good idea, what's an idea that's worthwhile. You sort of also feel like, hey, any new idea that I start working on, everybody around me has already been working on something for a while. So I'm already like, behind the 8 ball just by like starting a new idea. And so there's a lot of like, I think there's a lot of like, turmoil associated with all that. But ultimately, we built scale. It was kind of a perfect storm, I think, how it all came together. And I don't think there's just like a lot of serendipity. So I think the idea more or less was like, per the Paul Graham framework, it's like, okay, in the future, clearly we're going to orchestrate human compute much more dynamically and much more like we orchestrate any other resource, like we orchestrate compute today. And so you're going to get to a state where human computation, so to speak, is as easy to use an API as anything else, and that API doesn't exist. And so that was sort of the original idea for scale. And then after we had the idea, then I spent like a night just looking for a domain. Scaleapi.com was available, so bought it. That turned out to be an unusually good decision, I think. Scale has been turned out to be a really good name, and then we launched on Product Hunt, and it generated like enough traction on Product Hunt. And then there were probably, there's probably like after that, maybe like 4 to 6 months of just sort of like, you're kind of in this like wandering mode where, you have a few customers, you're trying to get more customers. I remember that like I would personally talk to anybody who would come into our company's intercom. So if you were a visitor on scaleapi.com and you clicked the little chat bubble, you would end up talking to me. And so I remember like there's like, it was this period where it was like still very unclear if it was going to work. And then it wasn't until 6 months later where we started getting, there was one client who wanted to be really big, and then sort of like the idea started to come into its own. But yeah, there's probably a year or so of what I generally call wandering, and I think that's on the low end, honestly, of most startups.
So let's focus a little bit on that angsty part. How did you deal with it? Did you just, because it's easy to look back on it and to kind of like acknowledge it as like a rite of passage and as kind of like a learning process. But when you're in it, it fucking sucks. So like, did you at that point, were you able to in some ways like stare the angst in the face, or were you just kind of like, I am along for the ride and it's just up and down every single day, every single hour?
One thing I'll say, I don't know if it sucked more so than other periods in the future of the company. So I think there's plenty of times that suck when building a company. But I think that the main thing that sort of got me through all of it was sort of I think it was, I think once we arrived on the idea for scale, that I did really believe, like, I get a very high conviction that in the future, this thing will exist and it doesn't exist right now. So then you have enough of a gradient to go off of at that point. And then you can, I think, have a reasonable confidence in the pathway. And like, hey, at some point, I'm going to like figure out how like we go from point A to point B. And that's going to be like this long journey. Um, I think that, so that I think was like pretty comforting. But I think in the process itself, I think I remember one of the things that like kept getting in my head was just like the survival odds in YC. It was like the Hunger Games, like, you know, 90% of the companies just die, and but they don't die for years. So you're just like, you know, unlike the Hunger Games where people die in the first day immediately. Um, for YC,
If you're gonna die anyways in 5 days, you might as well die now.
yeah, exactly. Well, that was kind of that was the most terrifying thing. I think the most terrifying idea was that like you could already be dead, but you might only find out in 3 years. Which but I think that like as I'm a pretty anxious person, and I think I channeled all of the uncertainty into just, you know, anxiously doing things. And I think if you do that, I think a lot of founders do that, but I think if you do that, then at the very least, like you feel like you're ruddering and you're making progress in a particular direction.
Did you ever worry? I mean, coming back to your point about for any idea that you had, you know, you can kind of squint and see like 10 people ostensibly doing something similar. And I always say that it's if you tend to get easily psyched out by competition in the early days, then you're in a hard spot. Because if you pair that with like extreme paranoia, which a lot of founders have, that's a deadly combination because you're never actually going to get over it. So I guess my question to you here is that Mechanical Turk kind of existed, and there were some other, I guess, players. Did you worry about them, or were you like, no, that is just not a good quality product, so I know I can do better?
Yeah. Yeah, there were a bunch of things that existed. And I think the actual answer here is the right attitude is kind of this like blustery confidence. And it's actually pretty interesting. I see this I was just at this conference with this guy from one of the key executives at Palantir. And we were both talking to this government customer, and he said this right in front of me. And he was like, you know, it's okay that you guys didn't pick Palantir, but you know, you're going to come to regret it. And, you know, it would have been nicer if you just picked Palantir from the start, and you'd be way happier, and we do a much better job for you than anybody else possibly could. But it's cool that you guys didn't. And, you know, you'll come around eventually, and eventually we'll be friends again. But for right now, you know, I'm not even exaggerating. It was like a ridiculously aggressive talk track. And that's actually a part of the success recipe for Palantir has been this sort of like, this like deep fundamental, not particularly grounded, I would say, but this deep fundamental belief that, you know, any software they build is God's greatest software, God's greatest gift to Earth, and nobody else can build software as good. And you know, there's some of that that is a self-reinforcing loop. And so I mention this because obviously, you know, if you're sort of like a rational third-party bystander, you can be like, oh, that seems ridiculous and that seems kind of, you know, obnoxious. But I think it's actually part of the success story, which is I think you need some kind of, you know, irrational self-belief to believe that you will be able to compete in the marketplace. And over the long run, you know, what ends up happening is you need to believe that you can recruit better than everybody else, and you need to believe you'll make better product decisions, and you need to believe you'll go the extra mile, and maybe other people don't care as much. And then over the long term, those things will ultimately accumulate to the irrational self-belief that you had. And so one of the things that I believed, or that we believed at Scale, is like, you know, I did a lot of competitive programming competitions and competitive math competitions. And so I felt, you know, if I have to end up competing with people, I'll do just fine. You know, I've done plenty of competitions to date. And so, you know, bring it. We're just going to build the better thing. And I remember there was like an 18-year-old YC founder I talked to maybe 6 months ago. And I asked her the same question. I was like, oh, you know, how do you think about competition? And she was like, I think for competition, just be better. Just do better. Just be better. And I think that is, you know, it's kind of blustery, but I think that really is the answer. You just have to like really believe you're going to be better. Um,
That speaking of that Palantir anecdote, they're just really good at
they're great. Yeah.
they're actually very good at making the customers feel as though that without their software, their business is actually going to be literally an order of magnitude worse off, right? And this is something I struggled with at Dropbox because, at Dropbox, we would build good software and the software would speak for itself. And every time we would launch something, somebody else would launch the same thing 2 days later. And it took us a while to understand it's like, oh, they weren't actually launching it, but they were very good at talking about it. So which philosophy do you follow at scale? Do you like to build the thing or do you like to sell the thing or do you find a happy medium?
I think you have to do both. Well, at least for what we do. So at scale, we have like small number of customers. They're very large customers, and in that world, you have to. I think it's like one way to think about it is perception is reality a lot of times, and I think probably a lot of the companies that you all have worked with, they're very data driven companies. It feels like the truth makes its way. The truth everybody serves a shared sense of reality and whatnot. That's not true at most large companies, and also not true within the government, unfortunately. But at a lot of large customers, perception is more real than reality. Like the reality is just so ugly most of the time that very rarely do people actually confront reality, and most of the time they just sort of choose to believe the perceptions that they live in. So what that means is, if you end up doing enterprise sales or you end up building enterprise products, that you have to, just as much as your job is to improve the reality, it is to shape the perception. And this is, I think, in some ways, Palantir's one of Palantir's superpowers is that they shape the perception better than most other technology companies do, because I think they view themselves. It's like a combination of a sort of acting troupe combined with a software company. And I'm not even saying that, they literally give an acting book to all of the new hires. So they did for a very long time. So
I think I think there's something profound in what you just said, because if I'm understanding you correctly, it's that most companies, including the government, they're already living in some perception because the reality is so painful. So your job is not to actually outsell reality; it's to outsell shitty perception with an even better one. Huh. Okay, all right.
I'm sorry. You also should produce value. This is not just this is like dark arts on top of if you build a good product. I think that like fundamentally you also need to build a good product.
Maybe switching to you personally a little bit. You're clearly very competitive, which is great. And you have extreme self-belief, which is amazing. But apart from those, what else would you self-identify as kind of being your 10x spike?
I think for us, the thing, I think my personal one, as well as I think it's exhibited in a lot of the key people at scale, it's really sort of creative problem solving, but in the face of kind of like the least sexy problems you can imagine. So, a lot of what we have to do is large scale operations. We have hundreds of thousands of contributors all around the world. We have to coordinate this process of them producing high quality data for models. And it's a very, very unsexy problem, but I think we treat that problem with the same level of respect that we would, let's say a math Olympiad problem, and we apply the same kinds of techniques. And we're like, okay, like, what are the most creative ways that we could solve this problem? How could you break it down? Let's like apply a scientific method towards solving it. And we think something a lot of great tech companies do, but we hold no sort of elevated sense of purpose of like, oh, we'll only solve certain problems, that we think about the impact of the problems. And so I think and then we work like hell, we work very, very hard. And the combination of these things means that that's ultimately, I think, the recipe that allows us to outcompete all of the competition, which is that we're smart, we're good at problem solving, and we also will treat the sort of like most lowly problems with the utmost respect. And what that means is over time, I think we've devised some pretty clever operational solutions, pretty clever technology, pretty clever products. And all these things have sort of come together in a way that it's be very hard. I think a lot of times when I look at other companies or other startups, you have one or the other. Either it's an exceptional team, but they they limit themselves artificially towards, esoteric problems that are intellectually interesting. This is a very common pattern. There's a lot of companies where you have a brilliant team, but they work on the most useless problems. And then you have teams which are like scrappy, and they'll work on really any problem that is given to them, but they just don't manage to solve the problems in scalable ways, or they don't figure out how to like abstract the problems into a way that enables them to solve it effectively. So this sort of combination of extremely strong, powerful problem solving, or extremely good sort of scientific process and technical ability, married with sort of full humility about the problems to solve.
How did you? I mean, that those unsexy problems, the ones that are operationally heavy, those are often just the ones that are hard to kind of motivate people in, particularly in the Bay Area, but I would say largely in Silicon Valley, to get excited about. So, have there been cultural things that you have tried to institute at scale, either in hiring or maybe onboarding, or kind of just like the things you talk about? How have you managed to make that a core part of your DNA?
Yeah. So, well, I think the main thing that we encourage people to think about is, uh, we want all of our employees to think about their sort of like their net economic impact much more so than their sort of like, the difficulty of their technical problems. And so I think a lot of times, like in school, or yeah, and particularly in school, you sort of like, you know you feel like you gain mastery by solving more and more technical problems, and that's fine. But I think that um, uh, there's an inverse correlation between technical difficulty and economic value. And it turns out like a lot of very economically valuable problems are not super technically difficult, but there's just like a lot of hair, and you just have to like sift through a lot of mess. And that's, I think, where most of the good startup opportunities are. And um, and so for us, I think what we really motivated our staff on is like, if you solve this problem effectively, then the net economic impact, if you just think about like net economic impact of problems that you're solving relative to just technical difficulty, that's the ladder you want to be climbing. And that means that, the unsexy but very valuable problems end up getting solved very effectively.
Cool.
I think Facebook did something pretty similar as far as I can understand.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good analogy to Facebook. At Facebook, we took great pains. That in most companies, like especially on the engineering ladder, you tend to get promoted if you tackle the harder problems, right? Like the harder the problem, you kind of, in some ways, there's a lot of implicit status and respect accorded to it. And at Facebook, we would often kind of be like, no, we would actually want to promote the most productive engineer, right? Like simply the person who actually cranked out the most code, maybe worked on like the least kind of like sexy problems, but maybe like, so I think it was a very conscious like archetype that we promoted. Um, and a lot of the senior engineers, the more traditional senior engineers, I think didn't get it. They're like, why is this person getting promoted? They worked on like, just like kind of, reducing the number of errors in our logs by like an order of magnitude, but that shit's easy. I mean, like, yeah, but somebody's got to do it,
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good lesson from Facebook. Um, let's maybe shifting gears a second. Let's talk about geopolitics. Um, so what are, tell us some predictions that you might have for like next year, as in how, obviously along multiple fronts, but certainly on kind of the technology and the hardware and chips, kind of like I would say the cold and the warm war between kind of like the US and China is definitely heating up. So do you have any thoughts on kind of like how that plays out over the next 12 months and how it might affect everyone in Silicon Valley?
Yeah. So I think the first thing to really observe, one of the most meaningful things from a geopolitical standpoint happened a few weeks ago, which is that, OpenAI obviously released O1 some number of months ago, our own preview. And the first replication of the thinking loop, so to speak, or the sort of like test time compute scaling, came out of China from DeepSeek. This is a DeepSeek R1 model. And this is like a very surprising result, that the first replication is not from, Anthropic or Google or any of the American companies. It was an open source model released out of a Chinese lab. what this tells you is a few things. First, I think there's no gap in research. There's basically no research gap between the leading U.S. labs and the Chinese labs. So, they're basically caught up in terms of performance, and it has like pretty far-reaching implications for how this plays out going forward. And so, that was kind of like a landmark result. And I think there's probably a few things to watch. I think the first is which AI technology gets exported more between the US versus China. There will be this race to see which AI stack, so to speak, becomes more globally adopted. So, um, you know, uh, in the first wave of technology, the US came out on top. So Google search is basically globally dominant except for China. Social networking, American social networking is basically dominant everywhere except for China. Then in sort of like the second leg of this race, when it was more about hardware and telco, China actually came out on top. Huawei technology became pretty widely exported globally. It was sort of packaged in with the Belt and Road initiatives, where China sort of pretty quickly became the partner of choice for the majority of countries around the world, actually. And now I think AI is kind of the third phase. So you can see that the US forced the UAE to decide if they want to be on the sort of like China Huawei stack or they want to be on the US stack. The UAE for now is picking the US. I think we're going to see a lot more decisions where countries are going to decide, are they on the US AI stack or on the Chinese AI stack. I don't think the US from a foreign policy standpoint doesn't even really care about being the AI stack globally. I think we care about being the AI stack to some of our partners, but not all the partners. That will be one war that happens. And the other one that happens is, the thing to really watch is the export controls. So one of the most important things that the Biden admin did is they launched very restrictive export controls on chips. So there's maybe like 1/100th the number of high-end GPUs in China versus the United States, because we don't let them buy them, and they also don't have ASML machines, and they don't have all of the sort of precursors to enable them to actually build the chip industry. With President Trump coming in and with sort of new players in the field, I think one of the biggest questions is, are we going to maintain a hard line on the export controls? I think we certainly should. That's one of the biggest things that's enabling us to maintain a strong advantage. And what is that negotiation going to look like? Because there's the looming threat is by 2027, President Xi and the CCP have said they want to take Taiwan. So, and they've asked the military to prepare, the People Liberation Army to prepare to take Taiwan by 2027. So there's this looming date 3 years from now, by which China's at least, the CCP is at least saying that they'll take Taiwan. And as soon as President Trump gets into seat and gets inaugurated January 20th, that's going to start the clock on the negotiations, which is, can we prevent China from taking that action, or prevent China from blowing out TSMC, or prevent the sort of catastrophic scenario, and what do we need to give in exchange? And I think that will be, whether it's the headline or it's like a low grade kind of negotiation over time, that is the big picture thing that we'll watch for the next few years. And ultimately, I think there's like too much incentive in the world. Like World War III will be averted. I don't think there's any interest to get into a hot war, but I think we need to watch like, what are we going to have to give in exchange for them not invading and not taking over the semiconductor industry.
Maybe coming back to your point about the AI stack and what, whether essentially like sovereign states or companies around the world will pick a Western kind of AI stack versus kind of a Chinese stack. Curious, like, do you think it's actually possible for us to affect that by anything other than actually innovating in our labs? I will admit, though, to your point, it has been a little surprising that after the inference time compute, it's kind of been what, like 8 weeks, 10 weeks, that we haven't seen an equivalent release by some of the other major labs, which is actually really surprising, because my initial take was that this feels somewhat like easy to replicate. It's just like, hey, just throw a bunch of like more inference time, essentially like loops on kind of like on the various techniques and essentially like, do some tree climbing and figure out the end result. But I haven't seen that be replicated, which is odd. And your DeepSeek point is a good one. So do you think we have to just innovate, right? Or do you think we can actually enforce it through policy?
Well, I think the first step is to not squander our open source industry, which I think, at this point, I think we're through that, but definitely there's a lot of conversation at one point of whether or not the US is going to more actively regulate open source models. Now that we're through that, I think that we do have, the United States has interesting levers at our disposal. Most notably, it's the export control. So I think for a lot of countries, we can negotiate and say, hey, do you want clusters of NVIDIA GPUs? Well, if you want those, you probably have to, you have to build on top of our stack. And that stack can include the GPUs, it can include the open source models, it can include sort of a broad package. I don't know if that's going to be a priority for the new administration. I don't know if this is a priority from a foreign policy standpoint, but I think we have levers at our disposal. Just in the same way that on the flip side, China has their levers. They can offer large infrastructure build-outs, they can offer debt, they can offer, a lot of free technology, and that's not stuff that we can match. So it's this kind of like give and take of, a few decades ago, China was like, or the US was indisputably the sort of like provider of infrastructure and technology of the world. Hopefully that continues being the case in the next era.
Yeah, I mean, I think to your point about the open source models, I think we're going to look back on the decision by Zuck to actually have like a frontier scale open source model as being pretty critical in that kind of like evolution.
Very American decision, for sure.
I know, absolutely.
Yeah.
Very patriotic, absolutely. Coming back to one of your other thoughts, I mean, obviously we have seen a lot of kind of like excitement about agentic AI. Agents kind of means everything and also means nothing right now. What do you make of it? Like, how do you think in 2025 that kind of plays out both from a consumer perspective, but then maybe also, I think it's a little bit clearer what it means maybe for companies, but like for consumers, I would still argue that I mean, I haven't used an agent to kind of do anything interesting for me yet. Well, I haven't really used one in the company sense either, but I'm curious, what do you make of that?
Yeah, I think where we are with agents, so where we are with models overall is that they're quite good within one turn, with one prompt response, they perform pretty well. And then the performance just goes down a cliff as you increase the number of turns. And this is kind of like, I mean, nobody will really go out and say it, but this is the reality of where we are. So they work really well is kind of like the Google use case where you ask a query and kind of look at the answer. Where they work really poorly is if you actually need to like work with the model and do something more complicated, they just kind of fall off a cliff. And so I think there's kind of two things. I think the first is the industry is gonna like the model companies are gonna have to work very hard to improve the reliability with greater numbers of turns and ultimately get these models to have some greater level of internal coherence and ultimately sort of, be more like entities. Right now, models don't even know what they don't know, and so they kind of bullshit. And, in general, you're sort of like, in interacting with the model on multiple turns, you're sort of like, it's like this bullshit machine that, is statistically more likely to be correct than incorrect, but it's not like an entity with any theory of mind that you're interacting with. So I think that'll have to change. But I actually think that like for this like watershed agents moment, the biggest blocker is just the product design.
Yeah.
And I think the models are good enough already for there to be some agent product or agent kind of product experience that actually will be pretty mind-blowing and pretty great for a lot of people. I think for the people in this room, it's probably not obvious because maybe we play with models all the time, and so we know that they're actually really good at a lot of things. But most people don't even know that the models are that good. And so Cursor is like a good example of this. Like I think most engineers didn't actually know that the models were super good, and you put it into Cursor, and all of a sudden it's like a part of their workflow. It's much easier to use. So I think that kind of moment will happen for consumers. And I think it really is just breaking the models out of the chat paradigm into something that's a little bit more baked into the fundamental workflows. I think this is the biggest startup opportunity in 2025, if I had to guess, is like actually iterating to find the right agent modality.
I agree. Um, Maybe let's move on to talking about, obviously, everybody is talking about one of the biggest limitations to building the next kind of generation of frontier models is simply accessibility of like data. How real do you think the data wall is? Um, what's your take on kind of essentially synthetic data for training models? And obviously, I think in this overall conversation, scale is a huge kind of like, huge part in the conversation. So curious to get your thoughts there.
Yeah, I think the frenzy of the last 12 to 18 months of conversation was just like, who has more compute, who has more chips.
Yeah.
The more chips you have, you're gonna win. And so it was just this like very unnuanced conversation around who has the biggest cluster, and whoever has the biggest cluster is gonna win. And then I think what's like coming to light is, you know, even with a much bigger cluster, you were hitting some data limits. Like, we're hitting the limits of all publicly available data, and we need a tandem approach of production. What are the specialized data sets in addition to the computational power that's going to yield much greater performance? And so I think, I mean, the this the data wall and the sort of like the wall on progress that we've hit right now is like certainly real. I think we've hit some kind of pre-training limits. And a lot of the progress now is coming from post-training. That post-training is much more bottlenecked by specialized data sets and sort of high quality data sets that don't look like the ones that we have on the internet. So data is really critical. I think there was a sort of like, there was a belief, one of the research beliefs was that, oh, the models will just generate or large scale reasoning traces or other kind of data that we'll just pre-train the models on. That hasn't really panned out. I think a lot of the experiments on synthetic data, it just turns out you lose so much of the real richness in the data distribution if you use synthetic data. So I think the reality of what's going to happen going forward is like, we're going to need to rely on new forms of human generated data to get to where we want to go with the models. But if we scale data in addition to scaling compute, we can keep making progress. It may not be necessary to have the sort of like, $1 trillion, $5 trillion, $10 trillion clusters that we were talking about a year ago. But we still probably need the $100 billion clusters. So I think I think there's some kind of normalization to the conversation that's happening.
Yeah, it's kind of like it was actually all about who had the biggest cluster, and then capitalism worked, and then we actually have a lot more chips, which is great. But I do think that the new bottleneck is on the data side. So, I mean, I'm curious, like, how do you think what scale's role in that? Like, obviously, you guys play a big role in the post-training part of the world, but do you think that are there opportunities for scale to even ramp up its presence on that front?
Yeah, I mean, we're having to ramp up data production across the board. So I think that frankly, what's going to have to happen is like, if you zoomed all the way out on the like path to AGI, so to speak, I think we're going to need, the computers going to have to scale exponentially, and then you'll have this like smaller curve, but this equivalent curve of like data production needing to scale up exponentially. And so I think we just need to sort of like keep scaling up on that curve, and it needs to scale with everything else. So you can't just scale the data ahead of the compute, or you can't get too far ahead of the other. But yeah, I think our role is really, our key role to play is in producing all the data to actually enable us to get to that, get to data scaling in addition to compute scaling.
Maybe shifting a little bit to, like, a lot of folks out there in the audience are founders of AI companies. What do you think is different about starting a company in the AI space versus, all the companies that have been created kind of in the prior generation? Like, what are some of the notable differences in your mind?
So I think there's a few. So one big thing in any new technologically new space, there's just a lot of uncertainty, and the flip side of that is a lot of bullshit. So so AI is no different as an industry. And I think a long time ago, probably software as a service was the same, where there was a lot of uncertainty, a lot of bullshit. But But AI is certainly to a point right now where like, I don't know, 80 to 90% of what is out there, so to speak, is bullshit. And a lot of like what people will say or what investors believe or what like other people, if you go to a party, will tell you, like nobody knows what the fuck is actually going on. Truly, nobody knows what is actually going on. And so, but there's a lot of people who would be confident and wrong. And so I think one of the things that's like hard about, I'll tell a funny anecdote. So
Now we're getting into
yeah.
okay.
So when Scale, when we were raising our Series A, so it was like 2018, early 2018. One of our first slides in our deck said something like data is the lifeblood of AI systems or something like that. And then we were pitching Sequoia. It was a whole partner pitch. I get to this slide, and one of the Sequoia partners, I'm not going to say exactly who, very loudly and confidently says, "That's not true. Andrew Ng just told me that we no longer need more data for AI, and so actually we're going to be fine without more data." This is like 2 minutes into my presentation, and I'm just like, I don't know what I don't know. I was 20 at the time, so I was a little shell shocked. And I was like, I don't know what Andrew's talking about. I'm sure I could talk to him about it, but you obviously need way more data for AI. And then he basically was like, no, I don't think so. And then he didn't pay attention. He was pretty senior, so he didn't pay attention to the rest of the presentation. Some of the junior people paid any attention. So I just went through the motions, and then it would like, obviously they said no. And that's an example of the kind of thing like there's people who are like very, very confident about some things, which will just prove to be wrong. And that's true in any early industry. It's certainly true right now because, so many people in the tech ecosystem are paid to have a thesis or to have theses. So it's like, if you're like an investor, you're paid to have a thesis and a point of view, and you tell your LPs about your thesis. Or if you're a product leader in a big tech company, you're paid to have a thesis and a point of view. And so many people have these like beliefs that are not actually truly grounded in that much reality. And so you're just like, I think if you're building in this space, there's a large premium in you having the ability to figure out what you actually believe and then executing against the flow to accomplish that. And I think that's probably the biggest thing. I think that like where you're going to get fucked is if you follow the trends, and like you could even raise a lot of money following the trends. Like there's tons of companies. If I look at the history of AI, there's tons of companies that raised like $50 million Series A's or $100 million Series A's by like doing something that was really like vogue and in trend, but then it turns out that was just a stupid idea. So I think that's like the hallmark. And AI obviously has gone through many ups and downs, and there'll be many more ups and downs in the future. But the biggest challenge I think for founders is to develop a sense of what you actually believe, and then also having a mechanism by which you're constantly learning from the ecosystem versus just digging your heels in a belief and then you get like washed out in the tide. That'd be the most important thing.
Yeah, I'd say that. So I mean, the kind of it helps to be right. But I'd say, I mean, there's actually a very interesting takeaway, particularly for I think the founders at SPC, which is that I think that there are very few categories or verticals that are actually have like any kind of incumbent or even kind of an emerging kind of like winner that's actually winning right now. I think a lot of this shit is still actually up for like grabs, because I think that, and it's not actually an indicator of like how much money has been raised, or even honestly like their usage metrics, because everyone's usage metrics are kind of low right now. So I think that you just have to not be psyched out. Well, you also have to be right, which is I think a good filter. But I also just don't think that I would not get psyched out about essentially like, the competition at this stage, because there's still a ton of opportunity. And if anything, if you have a bunch of people all kind of harping about the same, in some ways, approach towards a particular idea, it's pretty interesting to kind of take a slightly contrarian take on that particular subdomain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think in general, most people in San Francisco uh, don't really believe anything, and they like get all their ideas off of Twitter and parties. So, um, so I think your mandate is to not be one of those people and to think independently. And I think that's critical for being able to start a company because at various points, whatever you build will be popular or unpopular, popular or unpopular. And your job is to weather that crazy storm. And that's true at the highest levels. Like Nvidia, you know, has been at various points very unsexy and then all of a sudden very sexy. And they'll go through those waves again. And so that's kind of I think that's the mandate.
Yeah, something that Mark always used to tell us at Facebook is that you're never as bad as kind of the world tells you, but you're never as good as the world tells you, right? And everybody always takes the, like, oh, when I'm fucking struggling, then like I need to have belief in myself. But there's a flip side to it is when the world is telling you that everything you're doing is right, that's also kind of like a sign that like maybe you're not actually thinking critically enough. Maybe you're not actually being opinionated enough. Maybe like you're actually converging to like, that midwit mean. So I do think that there's something to be said about that. It's easier said than done. Like the echo chambers are real. We're all pretty susceptible to it. I'm curious if you agree with this, Alex. I think that one of the mythologies in Silicon Valley has been that in order to compete in AI, you need a lot of money. I would probably like take the opposite point of view on it. I think there's a ton more opportunity, either if you're actually doing on the foundation model space, I think there's a ton more opportunity in terms of being creative with like algorithmic changes, maybe even like in your data sources. And certainly like if you're building up and down the AI stack, I think you can get a lot further with having like contrarian creative strategies than simply going out and raising boatloads of money. Um, I'm curious, does that resonate?
So if your business plan is that you need to raise a lot of money because you need to spend a lot of money, that is in business terms a bad business because um, yeah, obviously you want to build a profitable company. You want to build something that makes money. So if you have to spend a lot of money, you're just deeper in the hole. Um, I think that oftentimes Silicon Valley gets caught up in certain sort of uh, races for these grandiose, ambitious objectives. And so, if you want to be emperor of the world by controlling the foundation model that is God, then I think, yeah, you probably need lots of money. But that's probably not the goal of most people here, or most companies. The goal of most companies is to, build a profitable business that has the ability to keep compounding for a long time period. And so, we watched this pretty closely in the self-driving car debacle, where there were hundreds of billions of dollars raised. I think close to $100 billion raised to build uh, large scale autonomous vehicles. I think like now with the whole cruise thing, I think actually like basic like exactly zero of those companies ended up succeeding. So all of the money that went into the self-driving cars, like you have one winner, which is Waymo, and it turns out they have an infinite bank account, so they're not really a company you can compete with. And I think there's a real analogy to where we are today, which is there's like, you know, if you want to get on the treadmill and compete on training foundation models, you're competing with companies with more money than you know all but 10 countries. Like it's truly like
Yeah.
um the richest entities that humanity has ever known.
That Microsoft should be in the G8. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
um and that's not a good strategy. I don't think you should try to compete with an infinite balance sheet. And so I think that like for sure right now, the imperative is like, what is a creative way, but what is a way in which you can develop something that is genuinely differentiated in the ecosystem, and also something that you can keep investing in for a long time horizon. Like I think for at least right now in AI, like the premium is actually just picking a certain problem to care about for a really long time.
Yeah.
Um, OpenAI and Anthropic and Google, these are like very fearsome companies, but they also have like literally a bajillion, like 10,000 things to care about and worry about and optimize for. And it's very hard for any of them to focus on a particular area. Perplexity, I think, is the best example of this. Like, it's still none of the other products are as good as Perplexity in just simple search-based LLM output.
Yep.
And so, and they haven't spent that much money. They're just like way more focused on that problem. So focus always has a big premium.
Okay. We'll open it up to the audience in a couple of minutes, so folks start thinking of your questions. But before I open it up, do you still write any code?
No.
No.
No, I used Cursor a little bit the other day just to kind of like
What's your hot take?
see what the hubbub is about. I think it's a great product. I think what I don't know is like, it's pretty hard to fully monopolize a workflow.
Yeah.
In this way. So I think that like, if you look at the history of comparable businesses, like just owning a workflow is very hard to hold on to over long periods of time, because like developers, like anybody, they're fickle and they're going to try something new, and eventually something new will have like one bell or whistle that's cooler. So I think it'll be interesting to see how they choose to like sync roots and how they try to lay roots to try to like solidify their position. But we built a great thing.
Yeah, no, I think developers are super picky and fickle. My take on installing Cursor was also like, oh, I don't like these 3 small things and ignore kind of the 10 great things, Who is one person that you think Silicon Valley should pay more attention to?
I think in general, Silicon Valley is very politically inept, so to speak, or like politically, I'd say like unsophisticated. And so the broad strokes, I mean, I think there was this great email that leaked a long time ago where it was like an email thread is all this demographic information of the baby boomers, and like that's actually the major thread to pay attention to. And then I think that in many ways that's like, if you get the like broad stroke political threads right, then those can be like huge trends for growth. And so obviously the major kind of the major political thread right now is populism and Trumpism and all that kind of stuff. And it's one of these things where like, I think, hey, I don't think tech companies mostly are apolitical, and so shouldn't be that focused on this stuff. But if you were to think like globally, what's happening politically in terms of greater isolationism, greater nationalism, greater populism, et cetera, there's good takeaways for like, what are the 20-year tailwinds that might be embedded in all the things that we see. And so I think the sort of like greater political literacy in Silicon Valley is underrated.
All right, I'll open it up to the audience.
I'm Ryan. I just wanted to ask you about your position on synthetic data. So you didn't seem very bullish on synthetic data for post-training. I wanted to hear more about that position. And do you think that is indicative of where we are right now, and we just need to find the right tricks, or is this more of a fundamental thing? Also understanding that, like you said, people get paid to have theses. You're also paid to have a thesis, and this thesis is important for scale.
Oh, sorry. I think synthetic data works for post-training, obviously, but it's like, I guess like synthetic data, it's not a philosopher's stone. It's not like this like thing that you just like, I'm going to press the button and keep getting more data out of it. It's like, you need to come up with all these tricks to get like, each trick gets you a little bit more synthetic data, and you need to like, fundamentally what synthetic data is like, you're leveraging the structure of the data, or you're leveraging all these priors that you can, or these sort of like structural, you're leveraging underlying structures in the data to get, squeeze out some amount of synthetic data to improve your model. Like that obviously works as a paradigm, but it's not like an infinite pursuit. It's not something that like work to infinity. And so I guess my overall thought is like, it obviously works, and it's obviously part of a world-class post-training effort. It's just not the like, solution to all of our scaling woes.
Hi, how are you? My name is Lorenza, and I would like to understand. Most entrepreneurs at the beginning they're told, you should target small to medium-sized companies. You shouldn't go for enterprise. You're likely to fail. So, what would you say, especially if I understand correctly, from an early stage, you focus on enterprise. Why did you choose enterprise despite the advice that said even from Y Combinator? And yeah, just any advice for entrepreneurs who want to go straight, cater to enterprise and not small to medium businesses.
So the issue with most enterprises is that you can't even believe what they tell you um, because there's like, then I mean, it's just like this. It's like this. Most large enterprises are these cancers, and most of the people you'll talk to have nothing to do with the success of the company, but they have some job where they're sort of like, responsible for a thing, and so you're like, it's like this whole rat's nest that you have to learn to navigate and figure out exactly how you leverage it to work. And but if it works, then obviously, it can work incredibly well. Um, all the largest companies in the world are either enterprise companies or consumer companies. So the sort of like this is like a really a comment about like very large scale businesses, but small, medium businesses, you tap out at some point. Now, this is not really a statement for startups. So I think for a startup, if you want, there are some startups that focus on enterprises. We were one of them. There's some others that I think have been successful. But if you want to do it, you have to know that you'll have to spend, let's say, 30% of your time navigating the bureaucracy and bullshit of an organization. Whereas if you work with small and medium businesses, then they don't even have time to lie to you. So they're just gonna, whatever they tell you, you can take at face value, which I think is a great benefit for startups. Yeah, I mean, I think the general advice probably is that like focus on small and medium businesses. I think if you want to like get liftoff and success as a company, small and medium businesses is definitely the obvious gradient. But I think depending on whatever the ecosystem is like if you're in a startup ecosystem where 99% of companies are focused on small to medium businesses, then maybe there's less opportunity there. And I think this was kind of this is the thing that I notice. If you look at longer themes with startups, this is what kind of ends up happening, which is that so a bunch of companies start, half of them are trying to model themselves against the companies that are successful at that time. They all end up being in like perfect competition with one another, so none of them get traction. Then some company that was focused on some fringe idea ends up having no competition, but that idea ends up working. And so then 2 years later, that's the hot company. And then all the startups try to copy that, try to model themselves over that company, and so on and so forth. And so you never want to be like, if you look at like all the companies around you, you never want to be exactly where all the other companies are focused. You want to try doing something that's a little bit fringe because it's kind of, you avoid the perfect competition, so to speak.
Sure.
Hey, Alex. Just a quick question on your thought on people's opinions and kind of having a specific opinion. I think people's opinions are often a combination of their life experiences, first principles thinking, and your own inputs. Now, it's difficult to be right if most of your inputs are bullshit. So what are your inputs and how do you filter for your inputs?
So what I choose to like, I try really hard to focus on talking to. So the best inputs for me personally are is like writing on the internet or like talking to specific experts. And I try really hard to talk to people who like truly do not care about what other people think.
Right.
And you'll find these people because they just really seem to beat to the, go to the beat of their own drum, and they'll seem very strange and weird, but like try to get the advice of people who like genuinely are independent thinkers, and also look at the writings of people who are independent thinkers. I think that's another thing. I think there's a one of the great benefits of, I think, the modern internet ecosystem is there's so much high quality writing on Substack that like you can actually learn so much about any individual thing from like experts who post about it on Substack. It's actually like crazy. And so those I think are the key inputs. And then your customers. And I think that like, you just have to, I adopt a mindset where like customers are just always right. And like, some people are successful in various ways without needing this, but you just have to like you have to be super subservient to your customers.
Cool. I think that's all the time that we have. Thank you so much, Alex, for coming by and sharing your thoughts today.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.